When fertilizers start flowing, world food production suffers. Things are bound to get worse, and yet again the global south will be at the mercy of the belligerents. In this episode of Above the Fold, we take a closer look at the fertilizer diplomacy playing out and the odious effect it has on food security. Russia has oftentimes been referred to as a gas station masquerading as a country by Western critics. Whether it's financial, military, or economical, a tool is just a tool. Ridiculed as less economically robust, the Russian bear has been stockpiling fertilizers not to inflate prices or supply its own farmers, but rather pressure partners around the world, especially in Europe. Western countries exert their financial and economic power through sanctions, but this time is different. A perfect storm has arrived, thus making the fossil fuel tool of the Russian Federation exponentially more powerful. Gas station Russia has a big hand to play in such an inflationary environment. Unlike the sanctions of 2014, the current rounds of sanctions placed on Russia are a de facto sanctioning of the entire world. Energy is the most important commodity, perhaps only third to food and water in importance. It touches all sectors of the economy. One could argue energy is the visible hand that steers the invisible hand of capitalism. Exploding gas prices also disrupt the production of nitrogen fertilizers, which are derivatives of natural gas. Production costs of nitrogen fertilizers are becoming prohibitively expensive because of the surge in gas prices. This and the emergence of protectionist measures by governments around the world to stabilize domestic food prices mean the fertilizer industry will remain unstable through 2022. This is bad news for much of the world. Russia produces all of the three main types of fertilizers: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash. Natural gas and coal produce nitrogen fertilizers. Mineral phosphates are key to making phosphorus fertilizers, and potassium fertilizers are made from rare potassium-rich salts. Nitrogen fertilizers are about 40% of the total Russian fertilizer production, followed by potash at 35%. And phosphorus at 15%. Russian production of mineral fertilizers recently grew faster than the world average. Russia's production costs for fertilizers are relatively low, and it exports more than 60% of its fertilizer output. Since December 2021, Russia has introduced export quotas for its fertilizers. Russian President Vladimir Putin visited India and discussed an agreement between Russia's Fosagro and Indian public sector enterprises regarding the supply of fertilizers in 2021 and 2022. Despite his own government's export restrictions, the Kremlin had been preparing and laying the groundwork to assure friendly countries of uninterrupted flow of fertilizers and energy months before invading Ukraine. Energy moves the world, and food stabilizes the world's societies. Without either, society crumbles. The Kremlin's message was clear: our friends will be okay, but our enemies will suffer. It's a remarkable anticipation of the state of the world economy. A world rebooting from a pandemic and supply chain shocks, coupled with inflation due to an over-exuberant money printing, wasn't ready for a war by a major energy and fertilizer exporter. Russian tanks maneuvering to the borders of Ukraine wasn't the only preparation the Kremlin was making since last year. In fact, the Russians have been preparing since 2014 to better withstand sanctions. Some say luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity. But there is no luck in this affair, just plain cunning. On the western side of fertilizer diplomacy is the hypocrisy the world has become accustomed to. Given the strict link between natural gas prices, which are soaring across the continent, and nitrogen-based fertilizer production, the EU is facing a fertilizer crisis that may turn into a food crisis. The bloc's main problem is not production capacity. European producers supply 90% of their own needs. Acquiring affordable input materials is the main concern. 68% of fertilizers used by Europeans are nitrogen-based. As we've established, nitrogen-based fertilizers are derived from natural gas. As Europe contends with heating its homes in the coming winter, the price and availability of natural gas for fertilizers will be moving in opposite directions. This key resource will be scarce and expensive. If fertilizers are so important, especially currently, one would think the EU would be supportive of its initiative to help reduce the reliance on Russian fertilizers. Thus, the EU is planning a new initiative that would structurally decrease poorer nations' reliance on Russian fertilizers by helping them develop their own fertilizer plants. But at a conference of diplomats last week, the EU Commission explicitly opposed the text, warning that supporting fertilizer production in developing nations would be inconsistent with the EU energy and environmental policies. The process of producing chemical fertilizers has a big environmental impact and requires an intensive use of energy. However, they are very effective in boosting agricultural output. For a starving continent, the environment is the least concern of Africans. The EU Commission instead has urged governments to change the text and refer only to a plan to promote alternatives to fertilizers or a more efficient use of fertilizers. And this is where the EU is worse than Russia. It's not so much about the environment, it's about protecting its own interests. While they sidestep their own sanctions to import more fossil fuel from wherever they can source them, the EU's policy of convenient environmentalism has been laid bare. The EU is the largest agricultural exporter to Africa. The bloc rakes in billions of euros each year, and it helps support employment to European farmers. A lot of African farmers who cannot compete with subsidized European farmers embark on a perilous journey to Europe as migrants. European farmers receive over 43 billion euros each year in subsidies. It's an immense and unfair advantage in foreign markets, such as Africa. It strengthens the EU producers' ability to export agricultural products at low prices to markets in the global south. Although 60% of Africans are smallholder farmers, a staggering 80% of local food needs are met by importing. Africans spend more than $70 billion each year on importing food. EU subsidies to its own farmers, along with what the UN Food and Agriculture Organization describes as unfair trade agreements, have enabled EU farmers to undercut African farmers dramatically. It's easy to read between the lines about the EU Commission's intent. It's not really about environmentalism. It's about stopping African countries from establishing local capacity to feed themselves and protecting their export market. The more fertilizers African countries can produce, the more mechanized their farming becomes. This in turn would shrink the EU's agricultural export market and reduce its leverage on Africa. The EU preaches about curbing hunger but instead have policies that perpetuate the dependence of billions in the global south. Africa could feed itself, but European duplicity keeps the continent on a tight leash and in persistently dire circumstances. Things are bound to get worse, and yet again the poor will be at the mercy of the belligerents.